available commands, press *#.
Good afternoon and welcome to the FEMA Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness webinar series. My name is Allison Albright. I'm the Regional Preparedness Liaison for FEMA Region 2. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the FEMA website in the coming weeks. You should hear audio through your computer speakers, so please ensure that your volume is turned up to only hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right corner, we ask if you'd like to receive news and updates from Region 2. If so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to our distribution list. We will have a question and answer session after the presentation concludes. You'll see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matter there, and time permitting, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation from today will be available for you to download in the file share pod as a PDF. You can click on the file and download it using the download button. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our Region 2 Preparedness Specialist to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Good afternoon, everyone. Did you know that FEMA's #1 goal in our strategic plan is to build a culture of preparedness? The Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Program is focused on preparing individuals and communities for disasters by providing useful information and training, inspiring people to act and be ready for any emergency. I'm Bijal Patel, Preparedness Specialist with FEMA Region 2. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'd like to welcome you to our Preparedness webinar series. I am pleased to be hosting today's webinar on broadband internet and expanding access and connection to rural communities. This webinar will lay the foundation for the basics of broadband networks, including key terminology and the speeds necessary for quality service. Our speaker today is Don Williams, PhD. Don is a Senior Specialist for Broadband Infrastructure for the National Telecommunication and Information Administration BroadbandUSA program. He is responsible for providing technical assistance to communities seeking to deploy and expand broadband capabilities. Prior to joining BroadbandUSA, Dr. Williams worked on the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, managing over $250 million in broadband infrastructure grants and led Davis-Bacon Act compliance for the entire program. He has extensive knowledge and proficiency in telecommunications policy and regulation. And with that, we'll pass it over to you, Don.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, good afternoon again, or good morning. As said, my name is Don Williams, and I'm a Senior Specialist for Broadband Infrastructure with NTIA's BroadbandUSA program. Well, thanks for joining us today for this FEMA 2 Region webinar. I want to start out by thanking Allison Albright and her team for putting this webinar together and doing the heavy lifting. Thank you. As part of BroadbandUSA, we've been offering technical assistance to local governments, nonprofits, ISPs, colleges, universities, and state governments since 2015. When we started this program, we were coming out of the Broadband Technologies Opportunity Program, which was a large $4.5 billion grant program. And we have changed that a bit because we didn't have any more grant money. And I want to tell you a little bit about my agency, NTIA. We're under the Department of Commerce, and we're responsible for advising the executive branch on domestic and international telecommunications and information policy issues. There are quite a few of them, as I know you are aware of. I'll go over a couple of them quickly. Our major initiatives cover broadband, spectrum allocation. NTIA manages the spectrum allocation for the entire federal government. We also provide the executive branch with internet policy and that includes digital privacy, the Internet of Things, the digital economy, and the global free flow of information, all of which are complicated and important topics for a country to be involved with and to continuously be thought about. But we also are partners in FirstNet, which is the nationwide public safety program, communications public safety program. NTIA is also involved in a lot of areas that are going to impact smart cities and state development. We have a multi-stakeholder group that focuses on cybersecurity and privacy, and that's coming up with the best practices and providing some blueprints for that field. We're also working on spectrum sharing. Spectrum sharing is incredibly important and going to continue to be important and contentious because we're going to have way over 50 billion new sensors put in by probably the end of about a year and a half from now. We're also a partner in the Global Cities Teams Challenge, which I think I'm going to cover not in today's presentation, but in the following presentation, which we'll talk about in a little while. So, what we're doing at NTIA, we are trying to create a program so we can educate the communities and the people involved, also assist communities, and also convene meetings such as this one being convened by FEMA. We run workshops across the country. Some of those are for groups of communities. Others are for whole states. We work with a number of universities and colleges around the country. We hold workshops for them. And since COVID, we're doing all of that virtually. So like the rest of you, I've gotten fairly used to giving my talks online rather than in person. And I guess the most challenging part for me is sitting and doing them rather than standing up on a stage walking around. But I'm getting used to it slowly but surely. We've produced a lot of really good documents and toolkits for creating broadband task forces. We have an up-to-date federal funding guide. We have good information on technology choices, planning, and network implementation strategies, as well as sustainability issues for rural America's networks. That information is available on our website, and at the last slide of today's presentation, it'll be there. If you just Google in NTIA resources, it usually comes up right there. The last effort we do is assisting communities, and that's what I particularly do. We have one group that focuses on digital inclusion and adoption programs. I focus on infrastructure projects. And the assistance that we can provide includes working with you on stakeholder engagement, creating a task force to figure out what your community or group of communities is going to do with broadband in the future. We work with communities on developing their requests for proposals, requests for qualifications. We can work with you on your business plans. We get very, very good information on how to help you construct a business plan, particularly business plans that will help you obtain financing. We can also help you obtain financing by showing you what programs are available and are appropriate for the needs of your community going forward. So that is generally what I do, and today we're going to be having a presentation on the basics of broadband technologies and broadband infrastructure programs. We try to focus on community outcomes. We're going to talk a bit about partnerships today. We are going to talk a lot about partnerships on March 4th. Partnerships are important because each partner can bring something to the table that's missing. And the partnerships that we're usually focused on are public-private partnerships, and those have been increasingly important in bringing broadband to certain communities in America. In addition, we try to improve coordination between federal agencies. In fact, that is one of our new jobs from the last legislative session. The technical assistance, you told me some about that. We are pretty good at bringing together diverse groups of people who have the same problem with broadband that are nearby each other. Sometimes it's better to join forces than to try to do things individually, and that's particularly true in parts of rural America. We'll talk about that in a little while. I also mentioned we already published guidance and toolkits. We share best practices. We have our own monthly webinars, which is the second Wednesday in every month, and those are usually quite helpful and interactive. And I also wanted to mention the National Broadband Map, NBAM. As many of you know, the FCC forms do not give you a very good granular information on who's got broadband and where it is. For the last 3 years, we've been given funding by Congress to work with state governments and develop a map, state maps, that will demonstrate where fiber, where DSL is, where hybrid systems are, where wireless systems are. And the main point of that kind of mapping is to make certain that grant programs at the federal and state level are put to the best use possible. And that program is going along pretty well. I believe we now have 27 states as a part of that program. And lastly, we run the State Broadband Leadership Network, and that includes the broadband leadership from each of the 50 states. And they get together monthly and talk about what's working and what's not working. And that's been a very good program to network and find out what's working and also find out what's not working. Okay, so RFP development, that includes RFPs for consultants, RFPs for engineering, RFPs for construction. We can look at high-level desktop network design. We can also provide assistance on a variety of asset inventories. And those asset inventories are generally of two kinds. One is to see what assets you have as a locality that can help defray the cost of broadband expansion or deployment. And secondly, what types of opportunities there are in your marketplace for broadband enhancing economic development. And our belief at NTIA is that economic development has become increasingly dominated by the importance of good broadband connectivity. And that includes businesses, hospitals, schools, and residential. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And that's really come to home to roost in the COVID virus. Implementation. We can work with you on regulatory approvals in terms of helping you understand what those are going to be. Also, we can talk to you about interconnection. We can give you information on internet exchange points, which we're going to talk about in a little more detail as we go forward today. Okay, broadband basics. Some of you are going to know this backwards and forwards. Others of you are going to know some of it. I hope that together we can review and have a really good understanding of what we're doing with broadband technology. So, as you know, broadband technology refers to high-speed access that's always on. And of course, it's significantly faster than the dial-up. For those of you in the audience who remember dial-up, there are still places in America that have dial-up. And the FCC is the agency, they're an independent agency, and they define what broadband is for the country. Back in 2010, the FCC defined broadband as 4 down and 1 up. 2015, it is now 25 down and 3 up. That's obviously a huge improvement over the course of a decade. However, it's also the case that with growing use of the internet, that may no longer be an adequate definition for a number of people who are thinking about that kind of a policy. When you have a growing number of people that are telecommuting, using technologies such as video conferencing, upload speeds are becoming increasingly important. And the upload speed is that second number. So 25 down, you can upload 3. That is good for many things. We're going to go over a list of what speeds you need to get what done, depending on what your goal is. Promised download and upload speeds, as you're probably familiar with your internet service provider, that is often not the speeds you get. If you look in the fine print on your agreement, that's what they're aiming for. That's not necessarily the speed that you are getting on your computer or your laptop at work or at home. There are a variety of technical reasons for that, and we can go into some of those a little bit later. But it's just the case that even inside of the federal government, different programs define broadband differently. There are a couple of USDA programs where they define broadband as 10 down and 1 up. And that's for low-interest grants and telecommunication loan programs. In some areas where I work, there is no broadband connectivity in many places in rural America. And 10-1 might be a great savings for them. But very quickly, I think, everybody's going to find out that 10-1 is not adequate going forward. And we'll come up with some of the reasons and hopefully some of the solutions for that, both during this webinar and a future webinar. So there's different kinds of ways to tame the internet. One is, of course, the gold standard, that's fiber optics. Another set of technologies are wireless. There are a variety of fixed wireless technologies. We'll go over some of those. And there's still DSL lines out there, digital subscriber lines. These are often in rural America. In order for those to be particularly impactful for an individual, you have to be pretty nearby. And the DSL systems have had to be upgraded in order to make DSL somewhat of a competitor these days. Finally, a lot of cable companies, which is the primary provider of residential internet service across the country, they have often put in hybrid systems. And that is, in its most advanced sense, fiber into a node area. We're going to talk about the nodes. And then from there to your house is coax cable. Those are fine systems. They're going to be here for a while. There are some companies, Verizon, who put in fiber to the home. Comcast also has some fiber-to-the-home systems, as do other providers. But mostly the cable companies are involved in hybrid systems because they have an awful lot of them. And it's not possible to just all at once remove coaxial cable plant in an entire MSO's area. That has to be done over time according to the resources that are going to be used for capital in those businesses. Okay. All right. So the FCC had a national broadband plan back in 2010, and the goals were for 2020. So the first goal was 100 million homes should have affordable access to actual download speeds of 100, upload speeds of 50. Goal number 4 was that every American community should have affordable access to 1 gig broadband service to anchor institutions such as schools, hospitals, and government buildings. So while we have been getting closer and closer to each of those goals, we are not there yet according to the information that I have. We're getting closer. And there is another broadband plan currently being developed and worked on. I believe that the metrics for those will be higher than these metrics. And the reasons for that is people increasingly understand the importance of broadband deployment for economic development. That is primarily what I look at broadband as, and we can talk about what that means just a little bit going forward. So I think we're making pretty good progress. Where we haven't made great progress is in rural America. And there's fundamentally one reason for that. Broadband networks, their main monetary metric is not so much economies of scale, it's economies of linear density. And that simply means how dense per mile are premises and businesses, because that determines the ability of a provider to make money. And making money is important no matter what organizational structure you have. And that's a problem. So most of the federal programs and state programs that offer funding for rural broadband expansion, they provide significant capital contribution costs up front. In the BTOP program, we provided 80% of the capital cost. Most of our networks were middle mile networks. I'm going to talk about middle mile networks going forward. But it is very difficult for any kind of organization, whether it's a co-op, county government, state government, to begin to develop broadband networks in low-density areas of rural America without significant capital cost subsidies. And that is something that is also a part of economic development strategy, because it turns out that when you develop broadband in rural America, quite a bit of the economic development goes to nearby towns that are not so rural. So providing a boost for rural broadband also provides a boost for the more dense areas that are near where that capital investment's been made. And offline, I'd be happy to give people some economic articles on that if they would like. Okay, why does broadband matter? Well, we've talked about a little about that. One is education. K through 12 We spend more than $7 billion a year on textbooks. Going digital can save upwards, and some studies beyond, $600 per student per year, which is a pretty healthy sum of money. Telehealth. Hospitals without health records, electronic, will spend $371 billion more over the next 15 years than their counterparts. And telehealth reduces hospital admissions by 25% and overall length of stay by 59%. Those are huge numbers. Give you some examples of how important particularly these two issues are, because I work with a lot of communities and these are big issues there. Education, a number of places because of the E-rate program, the connectivity at the school is pretty good. But when the student gets home, the connectivity is absent or not good enough to do homework. And that's the homework gap in broadband. So a lot of places I've worked over the last several years, school systems connected, pretty good. They can share master teachers. But when the students get home, they often have to get in a car. If they're driving, they do it themselves. Otherwise, mom and dad's driving them to a Wi-Fi hotspot so they can do their homework in the car. That is just not an adequate way for young people to be doing their homework. So that homework gap is a problem and continuously being worked on, but we'll have to do a lot more work. Telehealth is important in both urban areas and rural areas. In rural America, it's particularly necessary going forward because throughout rural America, hospitals have been closing. And they've been closing at fairly significant rates for the last several years. That is a problem. And telehealth provides possible solutions to that. And there are a number of states that took advantage of some of the early work and in conjunction with their universities at the state level have done really well with telehealth in their state. One of the examples I'm always happy about is Mississippi. Mississippi is often, not at the top of charts. In telehealth, they're right up at the top. They're doing very well, and they're very proud about that. Secondly, thirdly, local businesses. Let's look at that one. Okay, so you'll see this number up here, 404. 404 means that you're not getting through. The servers are not recognizing your messages. I think we've all gotten a 404 message at least once. That's basically an HTTP status code. It says the page you're trying to reach on a website couldn't be found on a server. That means that while the server is reachable, the page showing it can't. And that's frequently customized by individual websites and bad connectivity and latency problems. Another sign of that is you'll time out on the search. Those are all problems involving the actual connectivity by servers and routers to an exchange point. Public safety, incredibly important. Go back to jobs, though, for a moment, since that's kind of my favorite thing. Small business owners report that when they get connected with good broadband, they increase sales, they retain sales instead of losing them, and there is more job creation. All of those things are vital, and there's good economic and academic research to back all of that up. Similarly, communities. For those of you who have, sold a home or intend to sell a home, broadband increases the value, good broadband increases the value of a home somewhere near 3%. Some studies say a bit more. 3% seems like a pretty reasonable number given the number of studies. And even more important, it is extremely difficult now to sell your home if you do not have good broadband connectivity. That's one of the things people first ask an agent or they first look online, they're looking for, what's the broadband connectivity? For example, I could never own a home that didn't have really outstanding broadband connectivity because it's so important to my job. And that is also the case with rural America, trying to attract folks for jobs that are better paying than the ones that currently exist in those rural areas. So if you're trying to do some advanced manufacturing startups in rural America, it's pretty important that you have down good broadband connectivity. Similarly with public safety, communities without access to real-time data experience 25% higher rates of lost lives, injuries, and crime. That's part of why FirstNet is also being created. That's a nationwide, always-on, high bandwidth broadband connectivity for public safety. All right, let's get to the next slide. All right, so a couple of kind of, definitional things as they get going. Upload speeds, download speeds. Speeds are important when accessing and sharing the information online. Potential customers want to focus on download speeds. Often that's because, they want to have good non-flickering TV movies they're downloading. Upload speeds are also very important and can have a serious impact on the network's ability to perform key activities, such as hosting video conferences, sharing large files, collaborating with other team members. That's pretty important. Give you some examples of what kind of speed you need depending on what you're doing. So if you're at home and you're completing homework, streaming video, web browsing, and there are not that many of you at the same time doing it in a house, 25 and up is pretty good, generally speaking. If you're a small business and you're trying to manage your inventory, you're coordinating shipping, if you've got a point-of-sale terminal, you're probably going to need 50. And that's not a bad place to start. Our school systems, if you're going to share ed material, do online testing, access educational databases, you're really looking at 100 to a gig. Happily, a lot of our schools do have that facility, but again, the problem is that homework gap, because when the kids get home, they don't have it. Libraries, increasingly important. One of my favorite developments over the course of the last 15 years, I guess, is public libraries operating public computer centers. They've been very, very helpful in both urban and rural environments. But in any event, libraries are also going to need 100 to a gigabit. And that enables mobile hotspot lending of books. It enables maker spaces to be created. And finally, in some sense, hospitals. That's definitely a gig plus. Sharing health records, that is very data intensive. Those are huge files. Performing virtual consultations, again, that can take up quite a bit of time if you don't have a good connection. And connecting first responders. There are different types of telemedicine. There's the easiest type of telemedicine. You have something on your skin, you don't know what it is, it's a rash. Take a picture of it, send it to your doctor, he looks at it, that's that. Other types of telemedicine are involved with doing remote surgery. Those are systems that need significantly more than 1 gigabit connectivity, and they need the lowest latency possible. And those things are beginning to happen at the larger medical facilities and hospitals. but that gives you some idea of the kind of speeds that one needs depending on what one's goal is. Okay, we've talked a little bit about speed. Speed is the pace at which data can pass through a network connection, generally measured by megabits per second. Bandwidth, that's the capacity or the maximum amount of data that can pass through a network connection at a point in time. Latency, that's the delay between a user's request for data and the delivery of the data. Again, the click versus getting to the website. Reliability, the consistency and predictability at which broadband service is provided. That is increasingly extremely important for businesses, hospitals, public safety, and in this era of COVID, our school systems for distance learning. A helpful analogy is the experience of driving on a highway. The speed is the pace at which the cars are traveling on the highway. Bandwidth is how many lanes wide the highway is. Latency is the delay between when you turn the key in your ignition and your car turns on. And reliability is how often the highway is open and free of accidents. So that's more of a down-home way to look at an analogy of these issues. Latency can be an extremely difficult thing to overcome unless you have an excellent set of connections from your network to the middle mile to an internet exchange point. We'll talk a little bit about that going forward. Okay, so we talked about some baseline broadband speeds. If you don't have it, you can't participate fully in the economy. That's not very helpful at all. And the demand for internet is just grows every single week. And we're probably a little bit behind on the upload speeds because more and more people are in fact working at home. And most policy thinkers today are thinking that while there certainly will be some return to the office, some return to commuting, that working at home is going to stay with us and grow, so that residential homes are in fact becoming more like small businesses. And that's going to put pressure on all the providers that currently work the residential market. I'm particularly thinking of the cable companies. I know that they are trying to address this. It is just a large problem. They have a lot of network. And that's pretty vital. Okay, so this is a pretty neat tool. This is at the NTIA website. And what you can do is you go to the website, BroadbandUSA, and it's a speed simulator. And what's nice about the speed simulator, you click on it, and it will tell you how long it is, in theory, to get the information you want. So that is a pretty helpful one. It's kind of fun. It helps people in the planning stages of a network to see what exactly is their goal, what is their vision, what do they need to make that goal and vision happen. The other thing that's really useful to do, in addition to this, is to do speed tests. There are a variety of companies that you click and they will tell you what your speed is. And for many people, that's a disappointment. They thought they were getting a higher download and higher upload than they actually are. And again, that goes back to how many people are using the network at the same time. and what kind of connectivities do you have from that network to the middle mile and to trunk runs, internet connection points. So those are vital issues to remember every time you're thinking about what you want to do with a network. Okay, good. Network architecture. If you look, so backbone, middle mile, last mile. Last mile is the connection to the premise, the business. Middle mile, that connects the backbone network to your local networks. Backbone, that's the major high-speed transmission lines that link all of these networks across the country. So if you look at a map of the United States and you're looking at backbone networks, there are backbone networks running all across the country, but there are many more backbone networks running up and down each coast and in the Chicago area through Cleveland and Pittsburgh. Also down in Dallas, Fort Worth, some of the other major areas. Those are runs that they're not stopping off too many places. They're carrying large volumes of traffic between central aggregation points. And think of the internet structure, it's basically like an atom in the sense that the highest number of networks flows through the node goes to other nodes. And it's exactly the same kind of image as you would back in science class of an atom. The highest number of network flows go through the nodes present in the core. The nodes on the outer side are connected to those networks. There are isolated networks on the periphery, which are also connected to the core, and they can be cut off if needs be. So anyways, that's one way to think about this. Networks, backbones connect long-distance data transmissions. Think of this infrastructure that makes up the core of the internet. It's also has some called the cloud. Middle mile networks, they carry traffic from local aggregation points, nodes, to central aggregation points. Facilities that are middle mile networks, they connect neighborhoods, streets and cell towers to the service provider's core network. This infrastructure is in your community. You may not know it, but in fact it is. Last mile, of course, that is connecting individual users with broadband providers, businesses. Internet exchange points I just want to talk about because of their importance. An IXP, that's Internet Exchange Point, it's a physical location through which internet infrastructure companies, ISPs, web enterprises, communication providers, SAS providers connect exchange internet traffic. Network access points are the predecessors. First you go to a network access point, then you go to an IXP. And by having these kinds of transit interconnections outside of their networks, that reduces the cost to the provider. It thereby also reduces latency. So it includes reducing round trip time and potentially reducing costs. So these things are important. When you're planning a network, one of the things you'll want to find out pretty quickly, and you can online, look for maps, is where interconnection points are. Few different types of interconnection points. There are giant ones, Cermak in Chicago, for example, Atlanta, McLean, Virginia, others. And they have many, many switches. There are other connection points that have one or two switches. Those are very frequent throughout the country. And that, when you're constructing a network, those are the ones you're probably going to be looking for, because most of the big internet exchange points, they're in urban areas. Everybody nearby is already connected. They also tend to be a little more pricey than the one or two switch and the other kinds of networks, internet exchange points. Okay, fiber optic cable, two kinds of major construction: aerial, buried. As you know, aerial construction tends towards being less expensive than buried, which makes sense. It's not the case all the time. We're going to talk a little bit about that. A couple of problems with some aerial. Number one, it's exposed. I was working with a PUD up in Washington State a few years ago. They get a lot of snow. They've got limbs on their fir trees, pine trees. They're busting off. Very, very difficult for them to put up traditional aerial plant. On the other hand, trying to do something buried up there, a lot of rock. So what they did, they got a good deal with Corning. It's almost like a plug-and-play aerial. So if the aerial cable breaks, in this case it doesn't break, it snaps off at a pre-engineered point. And it can be simply plugged back in to the break. So you don't need a fiber splicer to go out there. You just need someone with a truck to get through the snow. That turned out to be a really good system for them. That's the kind of system, it has to be pre-engineered before they make the fiber. But that's an interesting way around that problem. Aerial fiber basically means bird damage can be a problem. It's got to be insulated more often than not. It has to have a certain distance from electric wires. That brings us to the point of making the poles ready, make ready. So I've been involved in a number of projects where it seems good, but you get one of your engineers to actually do some survey work of the poles, you know, not a census of the poles, that takes forever, but a survey work, you know, what do the poles generally look like, how can you take a sample. Been on projects where that literally, the make-ready work literally doubles the cost per mile for aerial construction. And that's because the poles are short and have to be replaced. Replacing a pole, you know, is $25,000, if not more. That gets to be pretty pricey. Other forms of make-ready are equally expensive, but mostly from the labor point of view of having skilled workers go up on the poles and make adjustments to where things are in order for you to get your plant up there. Buried is quite helpful in many regards. Number one, it gets away from many of the weather conditions, which can, you know, stop a system from working. The other thing about buried fiber is there's just a lot of different construction techniques. I want to talk about a few of those. Talk about it a little bit more too because I like the topic. If you're in areas of the country where you're going to get frost, you have to make certain if you're burying the cable that the plant gets buried below the frost line. Even so, the cable is going to have a particular type of covering to it. It may have to go through conduit. Anyways, problem with underground construction, and again, I'll just tell you a story. Working in a South Carolina county, managing a project, and the contractor that was hired, great group, put in a fixed price bid on it. unbelievable, and quickly discovered that in the section of South Carolina they were in, there was a lot of rock. So they were breaking drill heads pretty rapidly, and drill heads are very expensive. So that can also be a problem for underground construction. What you'll want to do in more sophisticated builds is they literally have sonar systems that can show you where the rock is, work with your GIS, your geology people. Because if in fact you have to go through a lot of rock, that's going to increase the cost dramatically, particularly in terms of the equipment you will need to bore through the rock, and you'll have to have additional man hours on the construction crews to get that done. Okay, a couple of different kinds of underground construction. Direct installation, most common. That's most common for long cross-country installations. Installation process is quick, and that's particularly true if you're comparing underground construction utilizing duct installation. Most common cables for underground are steel-armored outdoor fiber cables. Trenching is slower. Trenching, however, get a much more controlled cable installation, which is useful. Next type of underground construction is duct installation. Cables are plowed through underground ducts. The ducts protect the cables from harsh, unfavorable conditions. It also provides a nice opportunity for future expansion without the need to dig, because you're put in extra space in the duct or conduit. And that allows you to simply blow in the fiber when you need more. That is extremely helpful. The main cost of underground construction is digging the hole. Once you've got the holes dug, generally speaking, putting in more fiber than you think you need is a wonderful idea, because the cost per strand of fiber reduces the more strands you have in a bundle. So that's another nice way to think about it. Last one to talk about is directional boring. That's where your surface can't really be worked on. Good examples of that are railroad crossings. Basically, you get a machine, bore a hole under the surface, you pull the duct through the hole, and the cables are pulled through into the duct. There are a number of other possible underground constructions. There's trenching. Direct bury is also something that is sometimes done. But you get the feel that there are a number of kinds of construction techniques for underground. Each one has a purpose for the area that you're going to be in. So you have to get to know your area pretty thoroughly. And that's also part of your asset inventory structures, which I believe we're going to talk about the next time we get together. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we talked a little bit about hybrid fiber systems, which were coax and fiber. That's the predominant system for the cable industry up to the moment. They increasingly add more fiber to their networks, and that's also a very good thing. Anyways, coax cable, that was originally installed for cable TV. It's still the dominant form for cable. It's not symmetrical, okay? There's technical reasons for it not being symmetrical, which we don't necessarily need to get into. But the cable industry works on that constantly. They have their own laboratories, and they're working through that primarily with end-user equipment, better modems. Digital subscriber lines, DSL. We've talked a little bit about that. So DSL is really based off of copper phone lines. So when you know, fiber optics, you know, is everybody now knows fiber optics is great. But remember, there was a point in time when fiber optics was not something that was considered, you know, to be going to be commonly used for internet service. And that was because we were basing our ideas on who is the provider of our phone service. And they're doing copper. Problem with that is the speeds degrade quickly over distances. That's an issue. Okay. I see we've got a little bit of time here. Let's go to our next topic, which is one of my favorites again, and that is going to be concerning wireless technologies. So, wireless technologies predominate in very rural areas of the country. The reason for that is because they are cheaper to put up. They are cheaper to maintain. There are problems with each one of these technologies, but take the fixed wireless. Now, those are systems that can be situated on offices, homes. They can be put on the top of water towers. They can be put on the top of any high building. And in much of rural America, in fact, high buildings, high towers are part of the reason why they're able to get fixed broadband technology, because they don't have to put up the towers, which is very, very useful. Mobile networks. So, a lot of people think, well, if I have a mobile phone technology, I don't really need much else in terms of internet service. Not really. Obviously, it's necessary to have good mobile phone connectivity for economic development purposes. Working with a county out in Southern California not too long ago, and they had a great broadband development plan. Problem was, when folks from Los Angeles area drove out to look at the opportunities for constructing businesses there, they lost their cell phone coverage, which was usually followed by a call that said, yeah, we're not coming. So they did a nice wireless siting study we got done for them, and that should be on its way to being fixed. But if you're trying to apply for a job or do homework, these things are just really difficult to do on your mobile phone. So often we don't really think of mobile systems as part of broadband. Some people do. I myself think of them as somewhat different, but all the less incredibly useful. And it's already useful for precision agriculture, very much so. And we'll talk about that, I think, the next session. Interesting enough, we now got these licensed mobile wireless. Let's see, we have 4G, 5G. Now we've got groups meeting with 6G, and we don't even have real 5G yet. It's good everybody's making progress and thinking about these things going forward, that's for sure. I also wanted to take a little bit of time, microwave technology, that's high frequency between line of sight locations. Microwave can get expensive because you're really beaming in on one location to one location. That gets to be pretty pricey. I did want to point out, though, satellites. There's the traditional satellite provider, I think, is Hughes. They've got a number of satellites up in the air. They have been and are the major provider of satellite broadband technologies for rural America. There are, however, a couple of other players, one other player that's come along, and that's SpaceX. That's Elon Musk's satellite company. Had a couple of opportunities to look at some of their technologies working for clients recently. Their satellite systems, number one, are only half the distance in orbit of regular satellites, and they are much smaller. They operate very independently and can form basically a satellite mesh. I believe he has at this point about 10,000 users in the United States and abroad that are using that system, including a place I have some familiarity with, a reservation up in Washington State, Ho Indian Reservation. A very difficult place to get to. They now have this satellite service and they're pretty happy with it. It's not the cheapest service in the world so far. They plan on putting up more and more satellites pretty much every month. Their satellites weigh less, and they can put up many satellites at the same time in the same liftoff. So that's something to keep your eye on. In the recent FCC RDOF program, which was a Rural Development Opportunity Fund, Elon Musk's SpaceX got quite a lot of money, billions, and some providers are upset by that because they think the technology is still not proven, and they think that the latency is going to be awful because traditionally satellite technology has failed on the latency front. Tests by independent testing agencies so far on the newer Starlink system, the latency looks pretty good. There's still a long way to go before that's completely off the shelf, but that's a technology to pay attention to, because that could be a game changer for truly rural parts of the world. I remember I worked on a system where the roads had to be put in order to get to a place where we could put up the tower. So there's still a lot of rural out there that is extremely rural, and that might be an interesting venue for them. Okay, next slide. Okay, broadband connection types. This is basically, picture of your neighborhood. You've got the existing coaxial deployment as part of the hybrid fiber coax build, saving money by utilizing the existing infrastructure. Then you upgrade the middle mile portion. You've got the school serving an area with node branches, buried fiber deployment to aerial deployment. Got buried fiber deployment connecting residences, businesses, hospitals to high speed, and finally there is a microwave deployment. Too costly for the neighborhoods, but best fit for deployment to business and public safety entities, particularly in difficult terrain. So when a community evaluates its tech options, it may not be possible to implement a one-size-fits-all approach for the community. A lot of times, it's not just hybrid coax fiber, it's hybrid fiber wireless. And sometimes that fiber is used as the backhaul for the wireless portions of the system. We can talk a little bit about that in more detail, I believe, in our next presentation. All right. We are just about done. Now that you've got a little bit of information on Broadband Basics, next time we're going to discuss the impact that broadband can have at a local level, and we are going to be working on showing you how to plan a broadband network from the creation of a task force to stakeholder engagement to preliminary network design and to fundamental business planning. I certainly hope you all can join us for that next one, which is going to be, all right, there's that session going to be there, Roadmap for Planning Broadband Infrastructure. And here is some contact information to encourage communities to contact us if you have some broadband needs. If you would just like to call and hey, say, hey, this is an idea. How does this sound to you? We're pretty good sounding boards as well. Anyways, there's our website. That's my email and my number, and that is also Scott Wood's name, email, and number. Contact either one of us, and we'd be happy to talk with you. You can also fill out a form from our website, request technical assistance, pretty straightforward form, and then we will contact you. Anyways, listen, thank you so much, and if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to take them.
Thanks, Don. So we did get some questions. I'll start with the first one. We have a participant in Hawaii, it looks like, and they are asking, how would we here in Maui be able to receive this assistance? They're lumped in with a certain district that doesn't reflect their true population, structure, or needs. Do you have any recommendations?
Well, sure. I mean, I think I'd love to talk to you about that in more detail. Number one, I've been to Maui. Wow. Yes, terrific. Maui also has some difficult terrain. Yeah, I think let's have a conversation offline and see if we can work something out. That'd be great.
Okay.
You've got my phone number, which is 202-253-7604, and then you can see my email address. Love to work with you and talk about this. That'd be great. I've got another colleague who's done quite a bit of work in Hawaii. She'd be happy to work with you too.
Oh, great. On that topic, are you the contact for the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, or would you recommend contacting another colleague of yours?
Yeah, so Scott has done work in both of those areas, and he was instrumental in putting in a good bit of middle mile in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and he still has contacts in those areas. And I remember when we were doing the BTOP program, most people were fairly jealous of Scott because he got to go to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico.
That's an expert.
Yeah, please reach out. Yeah, reach out to Scott, reach out to me, and we'll hook you up with something.
Okay, great. Another question, what GIS services do you use for field mapping?
Yeah, so we're doing, when I work with a community, we work with whatever their GIS system, whatever their IT department is using. They're pretty good systems, generally speaking, with the exception of some very rural areas where the IT person is the IT person for the school, the health clinic, the library, and the county government. In other words, they're just swamped. For the broadband mapping group, which is out of Boulder, NTIA's got another, we do a lot of science as well, so we have basic science labs in Bethesda and out in Boulder, Colorado, where we actually test equipment and gear. Yeah, so they've been purchased. They've got an agreement with Ezra and a few other groups to put on a lot of layering onto this broadband mapping effort, so that depending on what layer you want to get down to, it'll have all the economic information, business information, workforce deployment schemes, et cetera. I'm not sure that was an answer to the question.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
The next question is about backbone network. Are all backbones fiber optic cable?
Yes, they are now.
Okay.
Yep,
The
absolutely.
next question Can you talk about whether 5G will be useful for rural broadband, or is it more useful in denser areas?
Wow. Well, that's the $50 billion question. So I would love to see 5G come to rural America. The issue with 5G is the signal does not go very far before it has to have another antenna. So what that means practically for suburban and urban America is cities are going to be utilizing street lights. So when cities now replace their street lights primarily to save on operating costs of electricity, they change the bulbs out. So they don't have to change them so much. They're much more efficient. At often the same time, they begin to make the design of their street lamp amenable to accepting 5G gear. But there will be, 5G there's going to be at least one more pole in between telephone poles for 5G. Unless something happens that I don't see happening right away. So the problem for rural and 5G is going to require fiber, lots of fiber, for backhaul to the network. And that's a problem for rural America because in a lot of rural America, they don't have middle mile, right? Lots of fiber that can be used to support 5G deployment. I know that there are some in the smart agriculture area. They know more about that than I do. They think 5G can be incredibly useful if it's deployed properly. Again, I just find it's hard for me to think about how that gets funded. I don't see any federal programs for funding the deployment of 5G in areas where people can't figure out how to make money off it. And remember, the reason rural America is not served is because the private sector has trouble figuring out how to make money off it. And it's not just the private sector. I work with electric co-ops. They have the same situation. They have a different mission statement. Their profit their margin doesn't need to be quite as high. They have a longer time frame, and they often think of themselves as economic development agencies. But to a one, they have to have a positive cash flow over that broadband network they're constructing. Because even municipalities, right? You have about 400 or 500 municipalities that provide fiber optic connectivity now. The vast majority of those are in cities that own their own electric system for obvious reasons. Every network, it doesn't matter who owns it, the network has to be able to grow, and it has to have positive cash flow. And that's where the government subsidies become so important, upfront capital costs. I think that sometimes I'll give you an example how important that is. In the USDA programs, right, there's usually 3 buckets of money. There's 100% grant money. Everybody wants that, because that's not, you don't have to pay it back. That builds your network, a big part of it. Second pot of money is some grant, some loan. Yeah, that goes, somewhat. At the end of every year, there's money left over in the all loan department because it's hard to do rural builds with all loan because it needs to be subsidized. That's my personal, that's not NTIA's position. That is my personal position. Mm-hmm. Long experience. But yeah, I'd love to see 5G out in rural America. That'd be great.
Okay. I think we may have answered some of this question already, but what broadband upgrades will the U.S. need to support smart electric grid and electrification of the transportation system with its connected charger station backbone?
Yeah, absolutely. So, correct. Smart grids need smart communication systems. That's going to be fiber. Our electric grid, we have been holding federal task forces on smart grids for a very long time. And it's not an easy thing to do. It seems like it should be easy. It just isn't. But broadband connectivity is a vital component of that. I'll give you an example of a really concrete example. So if you're a city and you own your own electric system, and most of those aren't generating, they're buying it from TVA or another generator. But one of the reasons they like broadband is because they do SCADA services and they do telemetry services and they want to do smart meter reading. That all helps their electric system be more efficient and effective, but in order to do that, fiber optic connectivity is extremely important. So it's possible that some of those costs of SCADA telemetry systems is going to be a part of their fiber optic build. So they have multiple reasons to want to put in fiber optic systems. The other thing for particularly co-ops, I guess, because electric cities are pretty dense areas, co-ops not so much. And there are still a number of states that have restrictions on what municipalities and co-ops can do to provide broadband. Some of them are, no, you can't do it at all. Others have different kinds of hurdles you have to jump over. So in those areas, you're limited to thinking about what members of the private sector providers can do and working with them. And working first with the private sector providers is always a good place to start because they actually have broadband assets already in the area. And that's a huge cost savings over trying to get broadband assets that nobody has and bring those into the area. So we always recommend sitting down, talking to your providers first, seeing what their plans are, getting some information from them. They may have plans for expansion. They may not, but you have to work with them and talk with them because they've got assets in the area. And if you want to get this done quickly to expand where they're not, they're the most likely to get it done quickly if you can come to an agreement on some form of a public-private partnership, where the public entity brings something to the table that facilitates the private partner expanding their network to where it isn't.
Okay, thank you.
Another
question, that I think is important because there are a lot of, maybe misinformation about 5G. So a participant is asking, in my community, there's a lot of concern about electromagnetic radiation coming from 5G boxes on the light poles. Is this a valid concern?
Boo. I can just tell you, I was I'm pre-service, I'm a federal employee. I was asked by a city in Texas last year. There were similar concerns expressed by members of their public, and they hired a consultant. And that consultant did a literature review of everything I think has been written about it in a scientific journal, and then they asked me to look through it to see if anything had been missed. I could not find anything that was missed, and their report was that you know, it's always a valid concern to be concerned about new things. Their opinion and my opinion, personal opinion, is I don't believe it's a problem. But that's, you know, my personal opinion. I believe that's the opinion of the providers as well. So I think that if you look at all the research that has been done, and there has been a lot, that may give you better confidence, better feelings about it. I have met people at public hearings that, you know, they're opposed to it, and I'm not, you know, sometimes people are hard to convince. So from my point of view, I think the scientific evidence is that so far what we know is that it's safe.
Okay, thank you. There are many more questions rolling in. I hope you don't mind.
Okay, good. Yay.
In rural areas that do not have the capability for broadband, what are they relying on and how are they adapting?
Well, that's a great question. So unfortunately, you know, cell technology is the technology they're relying on, satellite service, dish TV, things such as that. The problem is that a lot of rural America are losing population. So I work with communities that every year they lose population. And that just can't go on forever because things start to shut up. I mean, that's part of the reason hospitals have been leaving rural America, part of the reason clinics leave rural America. You know, that's that old saying, you know, you can't keep them down on the farm. Well, we're going to have to come up with some strategies that allow that to happen. And EDA and NTIA, USDA, we are trying to come up with workforce development programs, smart ag, advanced manufacturing, working on some more regional approaches, because rural America is vital going forward. And we have to stop the drain of rural America from an economic point of view. And broadband, I think, is a big part of that. Right now, it's satellite cell phone service, and a lot of the cell phone service isn't very good. And it's important that we understand that when rural America is not doing well, we're all not doing well in some sense. So that's my view.
Okay. Another question, how do you propose implementing a broadband program to a rural community, maybe with a high number of senior citizens, so that residents may take advantage of telehealth services?
Oh, yeah, great question. So, well, I'll give you a preview to our next webinar in 2 weeks. So, the way to do that is to begin to get a group of people together. Doesn't take very many. And to begin to sit down and think about what it is you want to see for that community, and begin to look around for people who have some skill sets that might be valuable. Retired engineers, somebody from the IT department, somebody from a community college, it's in the technology field. Setting up a group is probably the first thing to do, and that's what we do, and we hope we can help you do that. And then reach out to some important stakeholders in the area. Again, it's all going to depend on, you know, is this an over 55 residential community that's not near anything? Or are they, in fact, a 55-year-old community that's near some other area that may have broadband, in which case you'll want to work with providers to see how to get it out to where you are. But it's a good question, because one of the issues we didn't address today is the issue of adoption and digital literacy. Because remember, you know, I do infrastructure, right? But infrastructure doesn't work unless people are hooked up to it. And amongst the groups that have a more difficult time with the internet are older Americans. And granted, they are getting better and better at it, but still, it's a difficult road for some of them to get up and to figure it out. Personal experience in my family as well with that. So that's part of, you know, digital literacy, giving people confidence, and that's a really important part of broadband expansion and deployment, is making sure that the folks you're trying to reach with your network are looking forward to signing on to your network so that they can get what they need in their everyday life and in their work life going forward. So most federal agencies are keenly aware of this, and HUD has programs devoted to that. And reach out and we'll try to hook you up with somebody who can, you know, provide assistance to your thinking.
Okay, great. I think we'll do one more question because we're ending our webinar at 2:30. Are there any plans for a broadband access program similar to Lifeline?
Well, yes, there are, in fact. So there are already COVID CARES money that has been used by communities to defray the cost of your monthly broadband connection fee. Some of that has been done with federal money, some with state money. That was all part of the funding for COVID CARES. That money, I think, has generally come close to running out, but there is going to be more COVID funding coming our way. I suspect that will also be a part of that. I think in some of our recent grant programs, some of the funding can also be used to defray the cost of broadband connectivity. If you're unable to provide that for yourself, the cable industry actually has been reasonably good at this. If you're a family on a school lunch program, Section 8 housing, there will be significant discounts for broadband for you to connect to the internet.
Thank you. Don, do you have any closing comments for the audience?
Oh yeah, glad you could all make it today, and I look forward to seeing all of you, or some of you, in a couple of weeks. And if you have more particular questions, or you're actually thinking about forming a group, or you're in a group and you'd like some technical assistance in how to go about broadband expansion or deployment, give one of us a call. Happy to work with you. And again, thanks, FEMA. This was great.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. The slides from today's presentation are available to download on your screen. And if you can please take some time to answer a few questions about the webinar. Your help really informs us if our webinars are providing useful and great information. You can see the polls on the screen now. Please join us for our future webinars. You can click on our webinar catalog on the screen right now. You can register for Don's upcoming webinar as well, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.